All right, should we go ahead and all right, you want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm with CSU Extension in Broomfield. Just want to go over some basics for our talk today as people get settled. So your videos and your microphones should both be off. Please keep them off through the whole presentation. If we do see that the camera or the microphone's on, we'll just go in and turn them off on our end. You guys have already probably heard about Zoom bombing issues, so just in case anything does happen, just want you to know we'll end the webinar immediately. We'll wait about 5 minutes and then we'll reopen the webinar and you can use the same link as you used before to get back in. We are recording the class and the recordings will be posted at the CSU cohort blog website. It's the same place that the registration link was posted. And we will also be sending out notes and resources after the class with a link to an evaluation. And this will just go to the email address that you use to register. The chat is closed right now. We are going to ask that you use the chat to ask your questions. Cassie, our presenter, is going to be taking quick breaks between her sections and we'll open the chat up about 5 minutes before and you can throw in your questions and we'll also do some Q&A at the end. And I am going to turn it over to Cassie Anderson for her talk on edible landscaping. She's the Master Gardener Coordinator in Adams County.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Welcome everybody. I get to talk about plants and edible things, so I'm always happy when I get to talk about that. Today we're going to cover a lot of different plants that you can put into your landscape. You can put them in a food-centered part of your yard, or you can mix them in with your ornamental yard. I'm not going to get into a lot of details about cultivars or varieties just because there's not time, but we'll cover a lot of different things that you can plant in your yards that are going to do well here, especially along the Front Range, but across much of Colorado. So we'll get started. All right, so first off, what is edible landscaping? Generally, edible landscaping is simply when you incorporate edible plants into your ornamental landscape. So it can be, I put some very attractive foliage kale in with my ornamental bed, or I've got my apple tree as part of my ornamental front yard landscape. It can be a lot, it can be whatever you want to make of it, but it's planting edible plants in your landscapes. And really a lot of our edible plants are quite ornamental, they are quite attractive. So there's not a lot of reason necessarily besides tradition or history or sometimes local regulations. If you have HOAs that restrict, there's no reason not to plant your edibles throughout your yard. There's no reason to hide them. Sometimes it can be nice to have them up front and center in your front yard, especially if you plant them in a very nice and attractive manner. Edible landscaping is also nice because you know what you're eating, you know it's local, you know what you put into it, and it can help you reduce food costs. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes you are adding to your costs, but it can help if you do it in certain ways, especially with those perennial food crops. So I'm not a landscape designer, but I like to start this talk just touching a little bit on, especially if you're planning to incorporate edibles into your ornamental landscape, it's important to think about your design while you're working on setting things up. So you want to make sure that you create visual interest, that you create aesthetics as you're planting and planning. So you want to think about the lines of your yard and the forms, different textures of your plants, different colors of your plants. Some of your plants might bloom at different stages, and so thinking about when the bloom and when the fading will happen and how they can all interplay is really important for planning out a nice ornamental edible landscape. And there's also really important landscape design principles. If you think about proportion and order, repetition can be very aesthetically pleasing. If you have unity between different beds and different areas in appearance, then it can all kind of help tie things together and make it look a lot more intentional and less perhaps like just a ragtag vegetable garden. So the idea of edible landscaping really kind of got its foothold back in the 80s. A woman named Rosalind Creasy wrote this book, Edible Landscaping, and it kind of just kickstarted this whole movement of, yes, we can have our edible landscape, but it doesn't have to be utilitarian. It can be beautiful. It can be incorporated with our ornamentals. It can be part of our ornamentals. And so it's kind of been this movement, and you can take it as far or as little as you want to go and kind of work with it in that way. And there's a lot of benefits to it. It's can be beautiful. I mean, it's always satisfying. At least for me, it's always so satisfying when you plant something in the ground and it actually grows. And if you can harvest food from it, then it's satisfying. Like in this picture, this looks like a very, very traditional, very structured landscape garden. But if you start looking closer in the back here, there are raspberries. This is a fruit tree. And up here are squash, some kind of zucchini or summer squash in the bush form. And so you kind of have that nice mix of the formal, the very, very rigidly landscaped, but then the ornamental edible gets a little place in there as well. And it can be kind of fun to figure out where you can fit things, where you can make something work for you and get a benefit of something that you can eat out of it as well. When you are thinking about your edible landscape, it is important to consider your location. If you have a very, very shady yard or a very, very sunny yard, that's going to kind of change how you plan things out. How much space you have is also going to change a lot of the question. If you have a big open space, then you can kind of play with it as you will. If you have a smaller yard, if you have some large established trees or some walls or fences, then you're going to have to kind of plan things out a little bit more specifically. And you also definitely want to keep in mind how much time and how much attention you have for it. It's really easy, and I see this in a lot of first-time gardeners, to kind of take a picture like this wonderful walled garden in England, and think, oh, I'm going to plant this huge space and it'll be wonderful. And then come midsummer, your life has gotten busy, you haven't been out there to weed, you haven't been out there to maintain, and things get a little out of hand. So starting with a small space is always a really good idea. You can always expand, but if you start too big, then it can be overwhelming. And then also you want to think about how you're going to use the space. This is a very, very distinctly edible-oriented landscape that's been planted in an ornamental way, but it's not one that you would just go out and like hang out in the middle of this area. So if it's somewhere that you want to spend time, then you would design it and plan it differently. And then, of course, thinking about the aesthetics of it all. Lettuces and these annual vegetables, leafy greens, can be a really nice ornamental feature if you plan them carefully and appropriately. But if you just planted one row of these purple lettuce, then it might not be quite as visually interesting as if you planted the mixture like they have in this picture. All right. So we're going to dive right into our first section of what plants can you grow that are edible and ornamental. So we'll look at small trees. Small trees have a lot of benefits for us. They're a much more permanent fixture in the landscape, so it's not something that you have to replant or rethink every single year. And trees that are producing fruit for us will have a flower every year. They can have attractive foliage like this elderberry. They can have, even the fruit can be attractive. And so there's a selection of trees that do better for our landscape and edible purposes. Apples, pears, plums, black elderberry, even possibly there's some, depending on what part of the Front Range you're in, there are some hardy figs that might be okay in some very, very sheltered sections. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail on that, but if you have questions, you can reach out to us as well. but we will go into details on these other types. So if you're thinking about planting fruit trees, you want to think about your site very carefully. You want to make sure that your soil is fairly well drained. You do want to make sure that you have full sun. You don't want to have the tree planted in a low spot where there's a lot of residual moisture or extra changes in your temperatures. Generally a good idea to avoid south or west facing walls. This is because those areas tend to warm up sooner, and so you might get bloom sooner. And you want to delay bloom as long as possible so that the risk of getting your blooms frozen out is as small as possible. You really also want to make sure that you plan for the mature size of the plant when you are planting it in its space. And we'll talk about rootstock and sizes of your trees in a little bit. Now, fruit trees don't come without some problems. They can be messy. That's even if you get a fruit set and you didn't have time to go and take care of it and harvest it, you might have fruit drop. Or even if you are staying on top of it, sometimes you miss a few things and you might have, if you've got an apple tree, you might have an apple or two down. And because they are a sweet product, they do attract some pests. I certainly have seen my fair share of wasps on the apples on the ground in my yard. If you are managing for food production, you want to make sure that you're up on top of where you are in terms of pests and diseases that are possible for the trees, and that you make sure to kind of scout and search out what is going on your plants. Another problem with a lot of fruit trees is the hardiness of some of the types that you might want or cultivars that you might want. And of course, we've just come out of one of these events. Colorado weather is erratic, and it's looking like it's only going to become more erratic. And so late spring frosts can really be a bummer if you've got a really nice bloom and we get a solid freeze. So those are all things to kind of take into consideration when you're thinking about putting in something as permanent and sizable as a small tree. All right, so we'll get into our first category, which are the pome fruits, apples and pears. These guys grow really well in our High Plains gardens. They are tough. They generally will give us fruit at least every other year. Sometimes if you're fortunate, you'll get them every year. Rootstock on these guys does make a big difference. So the rootstock is actually going to be what controls how the plant grows. So you do want to make sure when you're searching for a plant that you don't just buy an own root apple or an own root pear, which is, I mean, you're not going, or you don't want to find, not own root, but a standard size pear or apple. You want to find one that's dwarf. Semi-dwarf is okay, but they do get fairly large, and there are some very extra dwarf. There's a couple different brands that call it like these certain superlatives, super dwarf or extra dwarf, that are going to be very, very small. The majority of the pome fruits are going to need some kind of pollinizer. They're going to need another tree of the same type or similar cultivar so that they can cross-pollinate most effectively. Some of them are going to be semi-fruitful, but you'll get much better fruit set if you do have a pollinizer. And in the case of apples, if you have an ornamental crabtree, that can fill that niche if their bloom times overlap. You're not going to get good cross-pollination if your blooms are 2 weeks apart. But if they're similar bloom times, then you can get some luck there. When you're looking for your pome fruits, for your apples and your pears, you want to make sure that you choose fire blight resistant. This comes from the rootstock, and all the companies that are going to have that rootstock with fire blight resistance will tell you that they are fire blight resistant. And you want to also look for those that are developed in more northern regions because they're going to be more cold hardy. You can also reach out to your extension office and ask what varieties they recommend specifically. You also want to look for some that are later season bloomers, because that's going to help reduce your chances of freeze loss due to spring freezes. So our next category of small trees that do quite well in Colorado especially along the Front Range, are your stone fruits. So your plums, your cherries, and then this also does include the cherries and apricots, and I'll talk about those in a moment. Plums, there are a lot of different, actually I think I've got them all broke, yes. So plums, if you're looking at finding plums that you can, most of the plums on the market are going to do fairly well. The European ones are going to be probably more familiar ones that you have from the grocery store. The Oriental ones do really well here too. And there are some American and wild plums as well. And this is one time I will give you a cultivar. If you're looking for one that's just extraordinary, it's Green Gage. Green Gage plums are amazing. They are a little bit harder to get established, at least in my experience, because I have planted 2 so far and still haven't had success. I'm going to plant a 3rd one pretty soon. But Green Gage plums are a great way to go. And with these, as you're looking for your plums, you just want to make sure that if you're buying 2 plums and you want cross-pollination, that they are varieties that will successfully cross-pollinate and will have similar bloom times. I have a grafted plum tree that I bought a few years back that has 5 different varieties on it, and they bloom in week-by-week successions. Kind of interesting to see the tree go with blooms all over it. But it's really pretty and it's cool to watch, but what that means is they are not successfully cross-pollinating with each other. And so having similar bloom times in the varieties you choose is going to give you a lot better fruit set. For cherries, it's definitely much more recommended that you go for the tart variety of cherries. North Star and Montmorency are some of the most common ones. And these are going to be much more hardy. Usually the nice thing about cherries is that they're self-fertile, so you don't need to have 2 necessarily, but it doesn't do any harm, especially if you've got the space. But if you are cramped on space, then 1 tart cherry is going to be okay. The sweet cherries we just really don't recommend much because they don't tend to be hardy enough in our cold. We had a lot of cherry trees that got knocked out back in 2014 when we had a cold event, and we haven't really recovered from that very well. The sweet cherries also do need a pollinizer. They need another cherry that's going to bloom in that same window. Cherries are one that our native animals know is around. They know that they're there, and usually their palate for them becomes a little bit, they are tolerant of them a little bit underripe, so by the time we're ready to go and harvest, the birds have eaten them all. So it's a good idea to have a plan in place to protect your cherries from birds. If you want if you still want to try cherries, but you don't want to put an entire tree in, you can do Nanking cherry. It's a large shrub, smaller tree. It's very tolerant of our soil types and doesn't have very many issues. It is a tart cherry, and they are smaller. They're not going to be nearly the hefty, big cherries that you get from the grocery store, but they make for very, very good pies and jams and preserves and that kind of thing. So the one that people always want, peaches and apricots. These guys are pretty unreliable, especially with our erratic spring temperatures. They tend to bloom pretty early in the spring, and a lot of the varieties are not very hardy in our colder areas. And they do have a mess of various issues, such as insects like the crown borer or Cytospora, which is a fungal issue that comes into the vascular system of the plant. A lot of times they'll survive with it for a while, but it will eventually kill the tree. But fresh peaches are pretty awesome. There are a couple varieties you can try: Reliance, Contender, and Polly. Apricots are actually one if you're not too concerned about getting fruit, but you are okay with it on occasion and you really like those spring blooms, you can definitely plant apricots for those wonderful spring blooms. Goldcott and Moorpark are 2 varieties you can try for those if you really want to try and venture into that front. So if you're really going for this, I'm going to go into a side tangent off the slide, but this picture is of an espalier tree. This is a great way to get good fruit set on a lot of our fruit trees in a very small amount of space. It's a very elaborate pruning technique where you prune the tree flat onto a surface. And there are resources on the internet for doing that, and it's a really nice way to be able to fit things into a small space with limited resources. But we're going to go into a few notes for our trees on pollination, pruning, pest control, and rootstocks, and then I will take a break for some questions. So if you're thinking about pollination needs of these trees, the trees that are going to be self-pollinating are going to be sour cherries, peaches, the European plums and prunes, and the apricots. They don't necessarily need a second pollinator. You're just going to possibly improve your fruit set a little bit if you have one. But if you're planting on the other side, we have apples, pears, sweet cherries, and Japanese plums. They absolutely need a cross-pollinator. They need a pollinizer in order to successfully set fruit. So kind of just important to keep that in mind. If you're planting a solitary pear and not anything else in your yard, it's very unlikely, unless your neighbor has a pear that blooms in the same time window, that you're going to get much in the way of fruit set. So that would be a shame. Definitely something that's worth planning out. With the fruit trees, it is necessary that you prune so that you get good fruit production. We do have some fact sheets from CSU here at the bottom, and there are a lot of other resources through other extension services as well that will help guide you in good pruning styles. Pruning fruit trees is very different from pruning our shade trees, and there's a lot of different ways to achieve it. There's a lot of different forms, and they all depend on what your goals are. So if you're like that previous picture and you want to espalier, that's going to be a very different style than if you're wanting just like the maximum amount of produce you can get, or if you're wanting to keep it small so that you can reach the whole tree easily with a step stool or something like that. The size of your tree, if it's a standard tree, keeping that pruned into a manageable manner is going to be a lot harder than if you have a dwarf or a semi-dwarf tree. The species of tree, you prune apples and pears very differently than you would prune a peach. So it's going to be very specific on that way. And the age of the tree, if it's been very well established and never been pruned a day in its life, you can't suddenly go in and start hacking it to pieces to get it into one of the more traditional pruning styles for fruit trees. And then, of course, aesthetic. You might be going for something that looks very, very manicured, and so you're going to prune that very differently than if you're going more for a little bit of a wild cottage garden look. So lots of things to consider when you're thinking about putting in fruit trees. In terms of pests, we do always recommend that you follow IPM, which stands for Integrated Pest Management. So you want, rather than treating something before you are familiar with it, you want to make sure that you identify your host, which is the plant that the problem is on. You want to correctly identify the pest. And with extension help, you can get some knowledge of the pest biology. You can do all of this through scouting and understanding your thresholds, understanding the limits at which a crop can sustain some damage. A lot of people get very worried with their apples about codling moth, but if you don't mind cutting that part out, then the tree and the fruit will be fine. But if you don't want that, then there are management methods that you can do to keep those pests out. But unfortunately, I'm already running, I've got lots more to cover, so we don't have time to get into a lot of the details on pest control. But the takeaway message for pest control is to make sure that you know what your plant is, what your problem is, and you go through cultural controls, mechanical controls, and chemical controls are kind of your last resort. Okay, so rootstock, I touched on a couple of times, but just to really formalize, rootstock, all of our fruit trees essentially are grafted, except for the peach tree that you planted from a peach pit as a kid in your backyard, are actually grafted. So they splice a root of a desirable plant for growth and productivity and disease resistance and hardiness onto that scion, that top part of the tree that has the fruit that we want. It's kind of crazy that this works, but it totally does. A few years ago, there was a big internet blow up about the tree with 47 different varieties on it or something like that. And you can do that. You can have, I mean, it's not very realistic to have productive 47 varieties, but you can have 3 or 4 varieties on one tree. And that's all done through grafting. But the rootstock is the really important part for the size of your overall tree, the productivity of your tree, the hardiness of your tree. It can be influenced by the rootstock. And a lot of the disease resistance is controlled by the rootstock. So fairly often, especially with our pears and our apples, you might see that you have some, it might say it's fire blight resistant, and that is controlled through that rootstock. So it's going to be an important thing to kind of consider when you're looking at the varieties of your plant. All right, so that is the tree section. Looks like Sarah just opened the chat. I am going to get, so the first question was on raspberries. We will be getting to raspberries. So the name of the style of pruning for small spaces against a wall is espalier. It's a French term. I'll just type it in the chat. Oh, somebody just did it for me. Yes. So espalier is that pruning. I always joke with my coworkers and the master gardeners that I work with that this year is going to be the year that I espalier my tomato plants in the vegetable garden. Some year I will do it and I'll take pictures, but it's a nice way to practice the principles of espalier without necessarily having the commitment of a tree itself. Do we have other questions about trees, small fruit trees? Okay. We've got a question on, I planted plums from seed between the driveway. You definitely can plant a lot of our fruit trees from seed. You're just very unlikely to get the same plant the same product from that because they cross-pollinate pretty readily. I was told to always plant the graft point of a fruit tree to the north. So the principle behind planting the graft point to the north is that winter heating and cooling, it just protects that graft from changes in temperature. It's certainly not a bad thing to do. What fruits will survive best in zones 3 and 4? I'm guessing you mean fruit trees. Fruit trees, you're probably looking most likely at the apples and pears, and you want to look for the ones that say that they're pretty hardy. What do I need for currant and making cherries and grapes do not bear fruit? Currants we'll get into in the next section. If your cherries are not bearing fruit, then it might be a sour cherry, or it might be a sweet cherry. It might be an ornamental cherry. There are quite a few ornamental cherries. And we'll talk about grapes in the next section as well. How to prune between 2 driveways. Kira, I will put my email up at the end, and you can email. That might be something that's a little bit more detailed than we can get into in this talk. Oh, great question. Any recommendations for preventing squirrels from taking fruit? So your very, very best bet for that front is going to be exclusion. If you have a small enough tree that you can cover it while the fruit is ripening, then you're going to have some better luck. Otherwise, you can put things like a cayenne pepper spray on the fruit that can deter them, or harvest, if there are some like pears, you can harvest a little early and you can counter ripen. But really your best bet is going to be exclusion, or somehow try and prevent them from getting up into that tree. If I plant other berries for the birds, will they leave cherries alone? Only if those berries are going to be ripe at exactly the same time, and even then it's not a guarantee. Really it's trying to protect them somewhere. Will lemons survive in the northern Midwest? Lemons are very, very much so not cold hardy. Lemons are, I don't think they're even hardy below around 40 degrees. So if you are somewhere, if you're somewhere that freezes in the winter, then they're not going to survive outside. Yes, we will be recording this video, or we are recording and it will be available, which Sarah answered. Okay, so black elderberry, is that a good medicinal fruit? So we don't really touch on the medicinal properties of fruits through extension. The varieties of cherries that I mentioned are North Star and Morenci. Apricot, I would have to pop back and check. I don't remember the names specifically. Let's see. Persimmons and pomegranate are not going to be cold hardy here in Colorado, unfortunately. And soils, we're going to be getting, I'll touch on rhubarb just a tiny, tiny bit in a little bit. So somebody chimed in and said that they make elderberry syrup from fresh berries. Definitely a good one. I just got a question about getting into cactus in the edible landscape. I have one little very brief mention of them. There are hardy varieties of nopal cacti that you can plant here along the Front Range. I don't have any specific names though, so you do have to find the one. There are plenty that are not hardy here, but you can find some that are. All right. I'm going to move back into the shrubs, and so we'll once I finish shrubs, we can answer questions about the shrubs. Okay, so increasingly shrubs are one that I recommend a lot for people who want to incorporate edibles in their landscapes, largely because they're smaller. They tend to bloom later than a lot of our fruit trees, so you get a more reliable fruit set. And they can be a little bit easier to maintain. You can grow them as kind of a hedge or a bank in your yard. You can have them in an edible area, or you can kind of incorporate them more into your landscape. Currant, so I'll go into more details on most of these, but currants are one that are really nice. They have a very attractive leaf. They have a very nice, pretty little flower, and then those lovely red, gold, or black berries. Gooseberries, if you have a space that you really don't want people walking through, gooseberries have these nasty little thorns on them. And so they can be a nice way to kind of delineate a space while still getting productive fruit. Serviceberry has interest through all the seasons. Elderberry is a nice large shrub, which can have very nice, pretty lacy leaves. There are purple leaf varieties, but there are also the regular green leaf varieties. Rhubarb, shown here, it's a nice one for its huge foliage leaves. And rhubarb's not truly a shrub, it's an herbaceous perennial. It dies back to the ground every year, but it has that size of a shrub, which is why I kind of put it in this category. So if you're looking at the currants, the ribes species, we do have a couple varieties that are native, the alpine golden currants. But if you're looking for a little bit more fruit, a little bit more bang for your buck, there are red currants, white currants, and black currants. Crandall clove is a good variety that's large fruited and golden, has a good fall color, kind of goes an orangey red, and a nice fragrance. There's also Eustaberry, which is a black currant crossed with a gooseberry. We've been trying those at our office for a few years. We finally got some fruit last year, and I have to say I wasn't in love with the taste. It's a little bit of a piney taste, but I'm pretty sure if you harvest it and process it, then it would be quite enjoyable. And that's right, I don't have a specific sign, but gooseberries are also in this category, and they are a very nice variety. You can get purple, green, kind of a goldish yellow variety. There are a lot of different varieties on the market, and most of them do pretty well here. So they're a good choice as well. The serviceberry or Saskatoon gives you really good fruit. It's a much larger shrub, almost on the size of a small tree. There are a couple different cultivars that can be big or small. There are some that spread a little more or more upright, so you can kind of pick and choose what your choices are. There are native varieties of serviceberry in Colorado as well. And here's just a nice demonstration of that year-round interest. They've got that lovely spring flower, then they give you wonderful fruit in the summer, and then in the fall they give you a nice red fall color, and we're always all searching for red fall color, right? So it's a nice one that hits a lot of the satisfaction points. Oh, that's strange, that changed color. So it's hard to read, my apologies. Elderberries are very ornamental. Their fruit and their flowers are edible. I know there's a lot of different things that you can make, like liqueurs and what's the word? Simple syrup or syrups out of the flowers. The other parts of elderberries, though, are poisonous. So you want to make sure that you are careful with just having the flowers or the fruits when you're processing. Elderberries are somewhat self-fruitful, but you're going to get much better fruit set if you have two of them. I think there's a little bit of a theme there you may have noticed. You can try the black lace elderberry, which is pictured here, Adams and York. Adams and York are green leaf varieties that are quite productive and do fairly well here in Colorado. All right, so that's a very quick rundown. I just realized I didn't actually get the rhubarb in there. Rhubarb is one that is going to need well-draining soil. It does need full sun, but it is going to pout a little bit in the extreme heat of summer. Usually by that point, though, we're done harvesting it. So if you can kind of just eke it through to the winter, then it will come back again in full force next spring and you can continue to harvest on it. So do we have any questions about shrubs? Okay, I'm looking for a bush and shrub to use for hedgerows and wind blocks. So for those, you're going to want those larger shrubs. Elderberry does get quite tall. The serviceberry does get quite tall. Those, and if you're looking for edible, if you're looking for non-edible, there's a whole bunch of others. We could definitely chat outside of this talk and get some details. For these shrubs, is there a best time of year to plant them here? You can definitely plant them now in the fall. I wouldn't plant much past the very beginning of October, just because you want to give them time to establish their roots a little bit. If you do plant them in the fall, you want to make sure if we have any dry or warm spells in the winter that you give them some supplemental water. But for almost everything, spring planting is going to be your absolute primo time to plant. Someone chimed in that their rhubarb had stunted stems and leaves this year. Yes, it's definitely been a tough year for our large leafy greens, especially if you can't quite keep the moisture up on them. The purple leaf variety of the elderberry it's actually a purple leaf elderberry. There are some cultivar names, but if you look for purple leaf elderberry, then you should be able to find it. Quince is not one that I've heard much success of here in Colorado. It's not one that I've heard much success for. Sources for disease-free currants, most reputable nurseries will not be selling disease stock, so you should be pretty good. Can gooseberries grow on the north side of the house? It depends what the shade situation is. So if you have a lot of shade on the north side of the house, then they need at least that 6 to 8 hours of full sun a day. So it depends what the situation is. But if that's your space to grow in, and you have enough sun, you can certainly give it a try. What kind of soil need does rhubarb have? Rhubarb is like most of our plants. It's going to like a slightly lower pH than we have, but they will tolerate our 7-ish and 7.5-ish pHs. Will my elderberry pollinate if it's planted next to blackberries, goji, and gooseberries? No, you do need the same type of plant to cross-pollinate with. Blackberries, goji, and gooseberries are all in different families, so they don't cross-pollinate. The wayfaring viburnums, I don't believe that those are edible. Do you prune back black elderberry? Elderberry is very tolerant of pretty harsh pruning, and it grows its new, it has more of a cane than a really, really woody stem. So you can definitely prune it back pretty vigorously. Deer have been eating my elderberries. How do you protect them from deer? If you can, physical barriers are going to be your best bet in that respect, even if it's just a temporary barrier that you put up when the fruit is setting. Is there an event where we could taste these different fruits for planning purchases and landscaping? That would be a great idea. Not that I know of. You might be able to reach out to folks who have their own businesses doing preserves or jams and see whether or not they have a lot of it. But otherwise, I don't know of any formal event where you can taste. That's a great idea, though. Now I'm kind of thinking, how could we make that happen? I'll have to think about that. Are there any edible shrubs that will do well in part or mostly shade? So a lot of the shrubs will do well in partial shade, but the clincher is you won't get good fruit set. So if fruit set is important to you, find the sunniest spot you can find in your area. And Eric just chimed in with chokeberry, could be a good choice for shady areas. Aronia. That is one that I didn't have in this talk, but I should add in. Are chokeberries good to use, and should you use fruit stones or cuttings? Chokeberries are good for you can definitely eat them. I wouldn't use the fruits. Oh, do you mean use the fruit stones like the seeds? I am not sure how well they plant from seed. You could definitely give both a try and see how things go. Did I already talk about blueberries? No, and I will not, because blueberries are not tolerant of our alkaline soils. You can fake it with planting them directly into a container of peat moss, but it's not one that we can plant in our landscapes. So it's not one that I really talk about in this talk. Are sand cherries self-pollinating, or do they need to have more than one to bear fruit? They are, like many of these, they will be a little bit self-fertile, but they will do much, much better if they have a pollinizer. How aggressively do sand cherries sucker? Well, I have 3 in my yard, but they don't get supplemental water, and I've never really had a problem with suckering. I would imagine that they might sucker just a little bit, but not very badly. Honeyberries are not one that I'm familiar with. I think that's one of those that's a common name, and I might know it by a different name. I will have to do a little bit of looking into that, and if you want to email me, I could get back to you too. All right, I definitely want to get through all of this. So yes, I will get a list of the plants that I've talked about. I don't know if I have the list characterized by self-pollinating or needs a pollinizer, but I can look into adding that in. All right, I'm going to get back into the talk just so that we can get through everything, because I still have quite a few things to get through. So we're going to talk a little bit about vines, and I'm being pretty generous with the term vine, but vines are a really nice choice. Vines can include our grapes. There is a hardy kiwi that actually does really well here. Raspberry and blackberry, you can kind of contain into a fence system if you do something like on this right-hand side here. You can keep it looking quite aesthetic. Raspberries and blackberries do tend to ramble a little bit. So if you're planting in your front yard and you have restrictions on edibles with your HOA or something, or neighbors who aren't satisfied with lots of mess in the yard, that might be something to keep in the backyard. They don't look quite as tidy. The hardy kiwi, I don't have a specific slide on it, but I want to just make a note. It does do well here. It's hardy in our zone, but you do need 2 plants. You need a male and a female. And so the more females, you can have 1 male and several females, but you need at least 1 male to get good fruit set. And it's not like the lemon-sized kiwi that you buy at the grocery store. It's going to be much smaller than that. They're usually more like a very large grape, but they are pretty tasty. So yeah, we'll get into just a little bit on grapes. And for here, I don't really have varieties for you, but we do have some good resources through CSU if you want to think about specific varieties. Table grapes are going to be more for fresh eating, seedless. If you're looking for grapes for juice and jelly, do be aware that many of them are seeded. So you're going to have to do a little bit more processing on them. If you're looking for grapes for wine, there are a lot of specific varieties, and a lot of the wine varieties are not quite as great a choice for at least along the Front Range. If you're over on the Western Slope, might be a different story. But there are some good grape choices for our area. Grapes are also nice because they are a large, rambling vine. They can cover fences. They can act as a privacy screen. The picture I had on the main slide had that really nice red fall color. However, they do need to be protected. They need to be sheltered a little bit. So they don't like our really blasting winds. So you do need to make sure that they're not somewhere where they're going to get really hit by a lot of wind. Grapes are really long-lived, so they're going to be with you for a long time. That they are also susceptible to Japanese beetle, which is an increasing problem, especially in the Denver metro area. So that's something just to be aware of, that you'll need to monitor for Japanese beetle if you have grapes. Grapes do definitely need full sun, and they are pretty sensitive to herbicides. So you want to make sure that they're in an area that they're not going to get sprayed accidentally or drifted onto by herbicide use. They are self-fertile, so you don't need a pollinizer for a grape to get good production, but the harder you prune it, the better your fruit production is going to be. So and there's a whole world of pruning for grapes, but you prune it really hard back so that you get lots of new growth, and you're going to get better fruit production in that respect. All right, raspberries. I'm going to not do a big disservice to raspberries just because we don't have a ton of time left, but there are a lot of different varieties of raspberries that do really, really well here in Colorado. There's different colors. We have a golden one, and in our gardens at the office, that does really well. It's nice and sweet. There are also the common red varieties, the black varieties, and they're a really good, highly productive, very satisfying crop. It is a very good idea to trellis them in some way. That can be as simple as putting up a couple of T-posts and running wire between them and having the canes rest on the wire. But you can go complicated as well, more like that post with the cattle fencing that I had on the previous slide. There are some pests, cane borer, spotted wing Drosophila. Mostly for those, you want to make sure that you're staying on top of your monitoring and making sure that you find it if you see it. Spotted wing Drosophila, the very best management strategy is to pick as soon as those berries start to ripen. You don't want to leave those berries to ripen on the cane and to get overripe, because spotted wing Drosophila really likes those slightly overripe fruit. And when you're getting raspberries, it's a lot better idea to buy from a real retailer who is guaranteeing that their stock is virus-free and disease-free. Raspberry is very susceptible to certain viruses, and if you get it, then you aren't going to eradicate it within the plant. You'll need to actually take it out and start fresh. So there are 2 types of raspberries. There are the summer-bearing and the fall-bearing. The technical terms being floricane and primocane. Generally speaking, the summer-bearing are going to, fruit on their second year canes, although once in a while you might see a fruit or two on the first year canes. And so that means your management strategy for them is a little different. You're going to need to prune out the old canes, but leave this year's canes so that you get fruit next year. And generally speaking, the summer bearing, they bear in the summer, in July. Because you have those canes that are overwintering, you need to make sure that you protect them in the winter because they will become very desiccated and you won't get good fruit set necessarily. More so, we generally recommend the fall bearing, the primocane varieties, because they fruit on this year's canes. The management is so simple because once we get our killing frost, you just go out there and you clear cut the ground and they'll come up next year and give you fruit next year. So they're a lot simpler to manage. Some people are some people feel that the summer bearing varieties have better flavor, but I've found with most of the fall bearing varieties I've tried taste pretty darn good. All right, any questions about, oh, and I did have blackberries in here, but for time I took it out. Blackberries are not going to do quite as well in Colorado, but they are a choice, and you can find some varieties. The primocane ones are the ones you're going to want to choose. All right, so any questions on our vines, our edible vines? Honeyberries and hacksaw, yes, they do well here. I don't, I have just a little tiny bit on them near the end. How do you know if your raspberries are summer variety? They fruit in June and September. If you're fruiting in June, then they probably are that floricane variety that fruit on their second year's growth. I had a raspberry plant for 4 years, never had a fruit. What's the problem? There could be lots of things. It could be the environment's not quite right for them. They don't get enough sun. It could, if you mow them down and you're not getting fruit on the new growth, then that could be that you have the floricane, the summer bearing varieties. Do we have skeletonizers on grapes here? I'm guessing you mean Japanese beetle. We do have Japanese beetle in a lot of areas. For raspberries, what exposure? They do need full sun. They do need a well-drained soil. Generally speaking, they're pretty tolerant of a fairly wide variety of our soil types. I lost my grape top this year, first time in the 5 years. Squirrels, birds, would bird netting help? Yes, bird netting on grapes will definitely help. I've actually found most people I hear raccoons are a big problem for the grapes. So some way of excluding is going to be your very best bet of protecting those grapes. Raspberries grow under pines. They might be able to grow. You're very, very unlikely to actually get any fruit from it because under all our conifers, the shade is going to be very dense, and so you might not get very much. You wouldn't get good fruit set because there won't be enough resources for the plant to actually set flowers. How to process and de-seed grapes from vines. There are a lot of resources online. That's not, I'm better on the growing side than I am on the processing side, especially I haven't done a lot with grapes. So you can look up some processes. If you do a site:/edu at the end of your search, then it restricts it to extension-based resources, which can be a nice way to know that you're getting good information. Is suckering a big problem with raspberries in Colorado? I found them to be aggressive with that in the Midwest. It depends on your situation. The raspberries definitely do sucker. Because water is more of a limiting factor for us, I've generally found that shovel pruning, so just slicing off the suckering of the raspberries, is a pretty effective management. Can raspberries or blackberries be transplanted? Definitely. You might not get good fruit set in the first year, but you will be able to transplant them. Japanese beetles, yes, they do like raspberries as well as grapes. Skeletonizers are a yellow blue striped caterpillar. I haven't heard that name. Not sure that I have heard of that in Colorado, but I could look into it. Do raspberries in Colorado need shaded bases like I've heard with blackberries? With any of these, I always recommend definitely mulching them in nicely. Having a good 3 to 4 inches of mulch, it can help with keeping the soil temperatures down and reducing weeds. Planted a boulderberry 2 years ago. It gets lots of flowers, but the berries never seem to develop. I don't know that name either. You guys are coming up with some stumpers today. Boulderberry. I'll have to look that up. It might be one that, okay. Boulder raspberry, thank you. I wasn't thinking in that respect. So it could be that you just don't have quite the environment that it's wanting. I'm not I'm not sure why the berries wouldn't be developing. Maybe some lack of pollinators, but I'm not quite certain on that one. Pests as caterpillars, I must have missed that. But yeah, caterpillars definitely can be pests. There are the cane borers in our raspberries that they'll burrow into the cane, and caterpillars can also eat the leaves for sure. And that's kind of that IPM strategy that I mentioned, that you want to monitor and use cultural controls and mechanical controls, and as a last resort, there's not very many chemical controls you can do for your food crops, but there are some options. So pest control, you can manage from multiple different approaches. And Amy, who's a fellow agent in Weld County, chimed in that Boulder raspberry is native to Colorado. It's more ornamental. The berries rarely are very tasty, and they tend to be sparse. Thank you, Amy. Okay, so I will get back in. What plants can you grow? In terms of ground covers, you've got strawberry, creeping rosemary, mints. There's a lot of different things. There are strawberries that are even as attractive as this picture, that nice purple, or not purple, red flower. And there are a lot of low-lying herbs that you can plant into your ornamental beds. And mint can be a very nice aesthetic plant herb that you can grow, but it is one that you want to be very careful of, because mint, if it's given free rein with water, will spread and spread and spread and spread. So mint, sometimes you can grow it as a ground cover, but it's probably better to grow in a container. There was one quick question about creeping thyme. Creeping thyme does do quite well here. All right, so strawberries. Strawberries are a good ground cover. There are 3 different types of strawberries. There are the June bearing, which generally have a lot of flavor. They might be killed by early frosts. They are going to be fairly productive, but they're going to be productive in a big flush and then a little bit more sporadic. The everbearing give you 2 main crops, and they're going to be really reliable crops. They start a little bit later than the June bearing, and the day neutral varieties are going to be fairly similar to the everbearing. The June bearing and everbearing crops are more linked to the length of day. The day neutrals are not. They're going to just kind of keep producing reliably. All right, what plants can you grow in terms of annuals? This is where you can get into the litany of our annual vegetable varieties. There are a ton of lettuces and kales and chards that are going to be very, very visually pleasing, especially if you're going for that aesthetic look. Tomatoes you can grow aesthetically, especially if you do some very careful pruning of them. Ornamental peppers are going to be the ones that throw their peppers vertically rather than the hanging down varieties. And so you can definitely do really well putting ornamental peppers out into your ornamental beds. Eggplants, I actually always think are really attractive, especially if you go for more the Asian varieties, the small globe or the small Japanese eggplants. They're going to give you a very nice fuzzy leaf and pretty purple flowers, and then those shiny glossy fruit once they start to set fruit. So there are lots of ways you can incorporate those more attractive and aesthetic plants into your annual garden. Just some visual pleasure on the wonderful different plants and how good they can look. I'm gonna speed through edible flowers just a little bit so that we can get to questions as well. If you're thinking about planting flowers for edible, then you want to make sure that you know what they are 100% before you start eating. But there are some great choices behind me. I've got nasturtiums. Nasturtiums have a nice peppery, spiky flavor. Violets are really good if you candy them. Roses can be the rose petals can be very nice. Daylilies can be an edible flower that you can use. So here's just a nice little list. We have an entire fact sheet on this, edible flowers, if you want more details, but there are so many flowers that you can grow as edibles. And I'm not going to read through all of them, but there are a lot of good choices. You can use edible flowers in salads, you can use them in baked goods, you can candy them, you can do an egg whitewash on them, dry them, you can put them in ice cubes. Flavors are extremely variable. They can be citrusy, floral, tart, some of them are bitter. There's borage, which is actually kind of tastes like a cucumber. So there's a lot of different flavor profiles you can find in edible flowers. But once again, with your edible flowers, make sure you know what they are and know where they come from. Don't buy commercial flowers and then put them in your salads, because a lot of commercially grown flowers might be using fertilizers and pesticides that we are not supposed to consume. So if you are using those, make sure that they are labeled for food crops. Start slowly, and some of them are not recommended for eating by younger children, so it's definitely a good idea to keep them as an adult-only snack. And you want to treat your edible flowers as you would any vegetable crop. So be aware of the pesticides and fertilizers you're using. If you're putting down fresh manure, then you want to have at least a 90-day window before you start harvesting, and that you're using appropriate tools and water sources and washing appropriately. Oh, this one did that too. A lot of my slides changed over when I opened my presentation. So herbs I don't have a lot on because I knew I was going to run out of time, but herbs are kind of your gateway edible landscape plant. A lot of them are really easy. A lot of them are very beautiful. Many of them are perennial, and they can fit the space that you need. Many of them are well adapted to poor or dry soils. There are the thymes and the rosemary. The rosemaries are a little more marginal in our area, but you can do chives and sages and some of the mints with the aforementioned addendum that they can spread some. They can be a really nice way to have, oregano, and they can be just a very nice way to add some flavor and aesthetics into your space. Okay, so if you're looking at some unusual crops, then you can try haskap. You can try hardy hazelnut, which does need a cross-pollinator. You can try goji berries. We tried a goji berry in our office, but it got harvested out by a rogue student helping us with weeding one time, so we didn't get to see how that went. Sea buckthorn and sea berry and aronia or chokeberry are all going to be some less common. They might be a little bit harder to find varieties that you can give a try that should do fairly well here. All right. I like to do my addendum because of the world we live in. A lot of us live in HOAs and have local regulations. Your HOA might not like having veggies or fruit or productive plants in your front garden. If you have the ability, make your argument. I think it's a great idea to try and change the opinion that you can sneak a few plants into your ornamental bed. I mean, if you look at the picture behind here, everything there, we've got fava beans and kohlrabi and lettuces, and it's beautiful. If it's well maintained and well grown, it can be beautiful, and you might be able to sneak it in, and someone who doesn't know it's an edible crop might not even know. So give it a shot. or work to be the force for change in your own neighborhood. And if you're looking at just improving the attractiveness of your overall yard, you can build raised beds. Concretes, metals, and woods are all great options for just making everything look a little bit more intentional in your yard. Garden art, or give bright color to paint your trellises or your cages bright colors. Just fun ways to make a little bit more fun in your yard. All right. So a little bit over time, but here's just a few resources for edible landscaping, and there's a bunch of other ones on the internet. If you want to find specific varieties, reach out to your local extension office. Definitely let us know if you have questions further. But for now, I'm happy to take some questions. All right, let's see. Do lima beans grow here? Yes, they can. They would be grown as an annual. How do you keep rabbits out? I feel like I'm a broken record, I'm sorry. Exclusion is going to be your best bet. There are some, what are they called? There are some sprays that you can spray, but they are going to need to be sprayed repeatedly after you water or after it rains, because they do wash away. So really it's going to be exclusion. Thoughts on honeysuckle? Honeysuckle is going to be it's a perfectly fine vine. It's not really something that we're growing for fruit. So it's a wonderful vine, very good for our pollinators. I love honeysuckles, but not going to be very good for fruit. Creeping rosemary. Most of the rosemaries I'm familiar with are not very hardy here, so unless you have a very sheltered space, it might need to be containerized and brought in the wintertime. Ooh, saffron crocus. Saffron crocus is going to be a little bit tricky to grow here. I know I've heard a couple people say that they've tried it, but I haven't heard of a lot of resounding success. Jujube, I know that there are some jujubes around, but I don't know that they grow super, super easily. Ooh, yes, shiso. Shiso is a very, very attractive Asian green, and it is a very nice annual here, yes. Is there a rosemary that's more tolerant of the Colorado weather? Not that I'm terribly familiar with. Generally speaking, for rosemary, I recommend that you either grow it as an annual or bring it in if you have supplemental light. But rosemaries, yes, are generally speaking perennial. How to move strawberries, shade or sun? Strawberries are going to need full sun. If it's in the way of your garden, you would want to dig and try and keep the roots relatively intact and move them elsewhere. Oh, can we grow sugar maples here? There are a few cultivars of sugar maples that will do well. Whether or not you're going to get the really good sap production that they get on the East Coast, I am dubious, just because we don't have the moisture to support it. But Caddo sugar maple is a variety that you can plant here. What is the best way to grow strawberries? You don't want them to take over. Honestly, strawberries do really well in a raised bed, and that would reduce how they take over, especially if you kind of manage those runners as they start to grow. It's Tarragona perennial here. I might call out to my fellow folks helping on the chat, because I'm not sure on tarragon. And my ornamental strawberries grow in shade, but no berries. I touched on that briefly. A lot of these plants will tolerate growth in shade, but you're not going to get good fruit set. You might get a tiny bit, but they need sun to set fruit. And for strawberries, yes, good protection from birds and squirrels. If you can put them in a raised bed that you could put a cover over, that's going to be your very best bet for strawberries. I have a hard time with nasturtiums in my alkaline garden, which is well irrigated. They come in great and lovely, and then they fizzle out in the heat of summer. You could try some shade cloth. If the heat really seems to be what's getting them, I would definitely give that a shot. Amy says to keep a neat strawberry patch, try everbearing or day neutral, cut the runners off, focus the energy to the mother plants. Definitely, yes. What's the best way to support our pollinators? Plant a variety of plants. Make sure that your season of bloom lasts from the very earliest part of the year to the very end of the year. Is there a list of edible flowers? Yes, in that fact sheet is a list. I actually don't think it has their flavors though. You could just do a little bit of researching. And then I had a question on an edible annual that grows well in vertical pallets. I would say for those, you're really going to be looking at your lettuces, your kales, maybe the chard, something like that. All right, I think I have made it through the questions. Happy to sit and chat a little bit more, but we are recording this. We will get this up onto the cohorts page as well. If you missed some of the previous classes, those are up on the cohorts page and you can go and watch them. We will be sending out a little resource sheet about the stuff that I talked about today, and we will also send you a survey. We just ask that you answer the survey. It helps us with future programming and knowing what we're doing well and where we can improve. So if you can answer the surveys, that would be great. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer other questions or see you guys again soon. We'll be back next Friday. What is next Friday? I've forgotten. Oh yes, I was going to put my email address in. I'm going to type my email address in the chat if you have specific questions. Normally I have that on the closing slide, but I forgot to put it in on this one. All right. Thank you guys so much, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and maybe I've inspired you to try and get a few more edible plants in your landscape.